Yom Kippur is a hard day, and it's been a hard year. There's definitely part of me, likely a part of you, that wants me to talk about something easy, something comforting, something hopeful. But there's another part of me, and likely another part of you, that knows we should talk about the hard stuff. Because that's where we've been, and that's where we are. It's been a painful, disorienting, and isolating year. One that has broken us and left us in pieces. And so tonight, I want to talk about the complicated position I think many of us find ourselves in, that many of us have been put in, because I don't think we can move forward without taking an honest look at where we are. I want to speak to the challenges that this past year has created or revealed for liberal American Jews. I realize there are different terms to describe the different subgroups of different people on the political left, and that all these categories are just social constructs anyway. But tonight, when I'm using the term liberal, I'm speaking to anyone who tries to prioritize values frequently associated with liberals, justice, equality, peace, and human rights. If you care about these values but don't identify as a liberal, don't worry, this sermon is for you too. This is not an easy sermon to give, and I know it might not be an easy one to hear. You almost certainly disagree with something that I say this evening, and that is okay. Please just know that my words are intended to help and not to offend. What I'd like to talk about tonight is the relationship between our liberal identity and our Jewish one, a relationship that until this year felt mostly symbiotic, but one that now feels deeply strained. And it's a two-directional tension. Our liberal identity has been challenged by our Jewishness, and that same liberal identity has challenged our Jewish allegiances. To resolve this two-directional tension, I think we will need to undergo not one, but two different reckonings. A reckoning with our Jewish identity as liberals, and a reckoning with our liberal identity as Jews. Let me start with our liberal identity and the disillusionment that many of us have felt in the weeks and months that followed the October 7th attack almost 1 year ago today. Before October 7th, I, like many American Jews, felt mostly at home in liberal circles. My liberal identity has been a central one my entire life, so much so that I even made the painful decision to leave Orthodox Judaism, another significant identity that I was raised with, when I realized the extent to which it was forcing me to compromise my liberal values. Like many American Jews, my liberal political values were neatly aligned with my more recently assumed liberal Jewish identity. Both identities compelled me to repair the brokenness of the world and to work to make it a better place for all people. In the immediate aftermath of October 7th, I naively assumed that Hamas's attack on Israel was so horrific that it would transcend politics. Surely, even those passionately critical of Israel could concede that an attack like this was beyond the pale and beyond any moral justification. I was wrong. While grieving the deaths of so many innocent Israelis, while fearing for the lives of those that were taken hostage, while still reeling from the absolute tragedy of the day, I started to see and read voices from some on the left who were coming out in favor of the attack. My liberal brain could not comprehend. Who on earth would not condemn such a heinous act, let alone celebrate it? I want to be very clear. I was and I am against Israel's occupation of the West Bank, against the Israeli military's dehumanizing treatments of Palestinians in the West Bank and Gaza, and against the growing Israeli indifference and even complacency regarding the suffering of Palestinians. I was and am ardently in favor of the liberation of Palestinians who deserve justice, security, freedom, and their own state alongside Israel. But Hamas was and is the wrong messenger for that liberation. And I mean wrong in every sense of the word, ideologically, practically, and yes, morally. Yet in certain circles on the left, Hamas could not be condemned. No, in these circles, any and all wrongdoing belonged to Israel and Israel alone, a country that apparently has become so egregiously evil and uniquely evil that any and all actions taken against it, no matter how ruthless, are justifiable. I know what some of you liberals are thinking, hashtag not all liberals. And of course, there were plenty of liberals who condemned Hamas and stood up against violence, against fundamentalism, for peace. But I think the appalling reactions of some on the left and the silent acceptance or denial of those reactions by far more left many American Jews like myself feeling betrayed and confused. Some Jews viewed this as the final straw, using it as the excuse to officially bail on their liberal identity, though frankly, I'm not sure how strongly that liberal identity was held by those folks in the first place. For those of us who have centered our lives around liberal values, abandoning those values is not really simple or even possible. The hypocrisy and blind spots of certain liberals should not invalidate the importance of liberal causes. Other Jews found absolutely no tension between their liberal identity and their Jewish identity, either by ignoring the extremist voices within their own camps or by ignoring the consequences for, at minimum, millions of Israeli Jews if those extremist voices were ever acted upon. But the rest of us American Jews, most of whom are liberal, and 80% of whom say caring about Israel is an essential or important part of what being Jewish means to me, are left wondering where exactly we belong. I've spent this past year speaking to Jews who, liberal to their core, have been excluded from liberal spaces simply because they are Jewish. I've heard countless stories about the various witch hunts led by certain people on the left against Jews who have any connection whatsoever to Israel, regardless of how incidental or how critical. And I've seen and heard with my own eyes and ears complete and total disregard for Jewish perspectives and Jewish pain. And so the first reckoning that we will need to undertake is the reckoning of how we can continue to actively work with and identify with other liberals who seem to be increasingly ignorant of and biased against Jews. While our Jewish identity has alienated us from some liberal spaces this past year, that same liberal identity has simultaneously made us feel like we're not always at home in certain Jewish spaces either. And so I now would like to turn to the second reckoning for liberal American Jews that has been simmering for a while, but has been brought to the forefront this past year. For decades, Jews have been convinced that supporting Israel was an expression of our liberal values. After all, Israel was the only self-proclaimed democracy in the Middle East. It espouses liberal ideals in its Declaration of Independence, such as Israel will ensure complete equality of social and political rights to all inhabitants, irrespective of religion, race, or sex. It will guarantee freedom of religion, conscience, language, education, and culture. End quote. And in many ways, Israel acts on those liberal ideals, giving queer folks equal rights under the law, providing citizens with universal health care, having Muslim and Christian members of its government, and much more. But the narrative that supporting Israel was a liberal thing to do became harder and harder to maintain as Israel moved further and further right, away from those democratic ideals. In the past few years, Israel has continued and even accelerated its ongoing settlement expansion in the West Bank on land that is intended for a future Palestinian state. This project, supported by the Israeli government, is being driven by right-wing religious Jewish extremists who seek to prevent the creation of a future Palestinian state, and who believe that all of that land is given by God to Jews and Jews alone. In 2008, Israel passed a law known as the Nation-State Bill that, among other things, claimed the right to exercise national self-determination in Israel is unique to the Jewish people, and downgraded the language of Arabic as an official language of Israel. Prime Minister Bibi Netanyahu has rejected the idea of a two-state solution while providing absolutely no alternative path to peace. These right-leaning policies and strategies reflect an Israeli population that is also lurching right. According to a Pew study just a few months ago, only a quarter of Israelis think that a way can be found for Israel and an independent Palestinian state to coexist peacefully with one another. Whereas just 10 years ago, that percentage was 50%. Meanwhile, the percentage of Israeli Jews who think that settlements help security has jumped from 31% in 2013 to 49%. And in an especially shocking statistic from a 2016 Pew study, more Israeli Jews think that Arabs should be expelled or transferred out of the state than don't, at 48%. Just 8 years later, in November of 2022, Israelis elected its most right-wing government in its history. That government has led this past year's war in Gaza. And these events, that election and this past year's war, have only accentuated the gap between Israelis and liberal American Jews. Many American Jews started to blame all of Israel's illiberalism on Bibi and this current government. Never mind that he's been in power for 14 of the last 15 years, elected democratically every time by Israelis. The more Israelis keep electing Bibi, the harder it will be to claim that Bibi does not represent Israelis. Now, I know in all of those elections, Bibi has never gotten anywhere close to a majority of the votes. In fact, the most he's ever won is 30% of the vote. But this actually highlights an even bigger challenge to trying to blame Israel's illiberalism on Bibi. Bibi has built his coalitions by uniting with other political parties that are equally, if not more, right-wing than him. And if Bibi loses the next election, which, by the way, is not for another 2 years, it is likely that someone to the right of him will take power. And even if someone to the left of him takes power, that person will most certainly not be left in the way that American Jews identify as left. In a 2013 Pew study comparing American and Israeli Jews, 49% of American Jews identified as liberal. The percentage of Israeli Jews who identify as left, 8%. And this was over 10 years ago. That gap is almost certainly bigger now. This trend away from liberal identity in Israel is reflected in the current government. Of the 120 seats that are in the Israeli parliament, known as the Knesset, Israel's traditional left-wing parties, Labor and Meretz, received only 4 seats, the lowest representation for these parties in recent elections. Barely any of these parties currently represented in the Knesset talk about peace, ending the occupation, or Palestinian rights. And while it's not an apples-to-apples comparison, it's fair to say that less than 25% of Israel's governing body, the Knesset, could be considered Democrats in the U.S. Depending on how you do that categorization, it might even be as low as 13%. Think about that. Here in America, with an election just weeks away, the battle for the soul and the future of this country is truly 50-50. In Israel, there is no real fight between right-wing and left-wing visions of Israel, because at least 75% of those representing Israel in its government lean right. Simply being called a lefty, a smolani in Hebrew, has become a bad word in Israel. It is widely understood that the left is dead in Israel. So blaming Israel's illiberalism on Bibi's current government is unfortunately not accurate. To be clear, I am not saying that all of Israel is entirely illiberal. There are voices advocating for a more democratic vision of Israel, and I'm proud that we have given a platform to those voices here at 6 and I this past year. There's a sizable number of Israelis who have been protesting this current government week after week, but those protests represent a minority of Israelis. As much as we wish to think it otherwise, we have to be honest about what Israel is and what Israel is not. And it's clear to anyone paying attention that Israel is not a liberal place, and it's trending away from its democratic ideals. I realize I have the privilege of living in America. Just like there's no atheist in a foxhole, maybe there's no liberal in a war zone. Israelis have every right to vote and to believe however they want. But the challenge for us is that American Jews are being asked to support Israel unconditionally, which increasingly means putting our liberal values aside. That cost has started to feel too high for many of us. We don't want to have to choose between our liberal identity and our support for Israel. We didn't think we needed to choose. Yet if Israel continues down its dangerously illiberal path, we will have to choose. And that is the second reckoning American Jews have begun to face. How can we support a country that continues to act in ways counter to our liberal values? These two reckonings with our liberal identities as Jews and with our Jewish identities as liberals, I think will challenge our core narratives about who we are and where we belong. I think this past year has awakened many of us to the tensions between our different allegiances that used to feel symbiotic. And this tension does not appear to be resolving anytime soon. I know it's not easy or fun to talk about a conflict between two important parts of ourselves. And I feel like it would be easier to privilege one identity over the other. But I don't think that we have to choose between these two commitments, to a Judaism that maintains a connection to Israel and to a liberalism that maintains a connection to liberal politics here in America. Those commitments, however, will need to shift. After this past year, I don't think we can hold on to these two commitments in the same way. I think that both of these commitments will need to become critical commitments. It's hard to hold an identity and to simultaneously be critical of it, especially when that identity is under attack. Israel is being attacked incessantly, both literally by terrorists firing rockets at it from all sides, and ideologically, as many people across the world are devoted to its destruction. Liberalism is also under attack, most prominently by a current presidential candidate. In these precarious moments, I understand the temptation to defend our attacked identities against any criticism whatsoever. But that is not what Yom Kippur is about. Yom Kippur comes around each year to remind us that we are not so fragile that we cannot look critically at ourselves. We can and we must take a hard look at ourselves so that we can grow forward, a process known as teshuvah. Teshuvah, translated for our time, writes Rabbi Daniel Ruttenberg, includes changing one's self-conception and self-identity in appropriate ways. Or as the late Rabbi Jonathan Sacks, the former chief rabbi of England, writes of the Yom Kippur experience, outwardly we are in the company of others, but inwardly we are giving a reckoning for our individual life, singular and unique. The fact that everyone else around us is doing likewise makes it bearable. Reckoning with parts of ourselves feel in tension is the path to becoming a whole, authentic, and integrated person. Not everyone will be able to walk that path, And the challenge that Rabbi Sachs doesn't address is, what do we do when our personal reckoning involves identities that others hold dear and don't want criticized? How do you transition from the private reckoning of Yom Kippur back into spaces with others who might not view self-criticism so favorably? We have the freedom to show up in a given space. For our own sanity, we might need to pick our battles, but we cannot let others' fears of self-criticism prevent us from taking on these reckonings that we must take on. Those of us who are liberal and whose Judaism includes a connection to Israel can hold on to both of these things in this year ahead. To do so, we're going to need to work extra hard, not to compartmentalize or fragment ourselves. We'll need to bring our full Jewish selves into liberal spaces, and we'll need to bring our full liberal selves into Jewish spaces. And when we feel that we are being asked to check one of those identities at the door in order to express the other, we will have to think twice about whether that door is worth walking through. And if and when we decide to avoid certain spaces that demand that we cut off too much of ourselves, we must remember that there are other spaces, other people who do not make those same demands of us. We must seek out and cultivate spaces of people who allow us to be fully Jewish and fully liberal, where those two identities coexist by challenging one another. I'll try to end on a word of comfort. For those of you who have resonated with at least some of what I've talked about tonight, I hope it helps to know that you are not alone. It stands to reason that the majority of American Jews don't want to hide parts of their Jewishness in order to fit into liberal spaces, or to hide their liberal values in order to fit into certain Jewish spaces. Yet for many of you, that has been put to the test this past year. A year that has been painfully disorienting, causing me to question my core commitments and even my sense of self. What has given me comfort this past year is realizing that while some cannot tolerate these two identities coexisting inside of me, at least I can. I come from a long line of people unafraid to grapple with complicated and competing identities and values, beginning with our forefather Jacob, who wrestled with God and whose name was therefore changed to Israel, which means wrestled with God. The Jewish people are called Bnei Yisrael, the children of this newly named Israel. I do not know how our commitments might be tested in the year or years ahead, but I do take comfort in knowing that I am not the first to wrestle with my commitments and that I'm not alone. Wishing each of you a meaningful Yom Kippur and year ahead.